Hashem, today's daf yomi is Avodah Zarah daf Zion, and we're going to begin on the bottom of Vav Amud 4 lines above where the lines first get wide. Gemara tells us in today's daf yomi that our Mishnah had said that I do business 3 days before, 3 days after a holiday. In that context, Rabbi Yehuda said you're allowed to collect payment from the idolater our Mishnah said I do business 3 days before a holiday, and you can't pay them and you can't collect payment from them. In that context, Rabbi Yehuda says you can collect payment from them because it's upsetting for them to have to pay. So the rabbis respond to Rabbi Yehuda by saying, even though they're upset to pay now, they're going to be happy after the fact. So the Gemara, even though even though it's upsetting now, they're happy after the fact. So the Gemara says, doesn't Rabbi Yehuda himself agree with that position? Because we have a concept. But we have this concept. But Tanya, we have a brisa. The brisa says a woman is not allowed to. She used to put this like cream on her face, which was painful or disgusting because it smelled bad. You can't do it on Chol Moed because it's disgusting. But on Moed Rabbi Yehuda, that if she would be able to take it off on Chol Moed, then Rabbi Yehuda would allow her to do it on Chol Moed. Because because even though it's upsetting to her to do it now, she's going to be happy after the fact on Chol Moed itself. So we see from here, Rabbi Yehuda accepts the concept in the case of Chol Moed, that even though it's upsetting for her now, that it'll be happy for her after the fact. So he allows it. So why in the case of payment to an idolater, where you accept the payment from idolater, why there does he not apply this logic that the idolater will be happy after the fact? So the Gemara gives two answers. The first is Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Hanach leHilchos Moed. The laws of Chol Moed are totally different. Because the kulu meitzer achshav simcha achasman, everything about Chol Moed is you're doing something which is painful or disturbing now, and you'll be happy after the fact. That's the whole concept of Yom Tov. You work hard, and then you get to enjoy. So that's the answer of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, that the case of Chol Moed is not the normal case. The normal case is the concept that we say Rabbi Yehuda doesn't accept this principle. That even though it's upsetting now, it'll be happy after the fact. Ravina says the opposite. He says, no, Rabbi Yehuda does not accept the principle. Rabbi Yehuda does not accept the principle. Excuse me, the opposite. Ravina says that the case of Chol Moed is the controlling case, meaning to say, Rabbi Yehuda says, even though it's upsetting to her now, she'll be happy after the fact. So why does he not apply this principle in the case of the idolaters? The idolater is not going to be happy in the end. He's always upset to have to pay. So the case of the idolater is different. The Olam Meitzer is always going to be upset. So the Gemara says, Masnisin, the Loka Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha. Our Mishnah, which says that the rabbis say that it says in our Mishnah that you're not allowed to collect from any debt before the holiday, and Rabbi Yehuda's position that you are allowed to collect from them before the holiday. So neither one is consistent with the position of Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, meaning the rabbis who say that you're not allowed to collect, Rabbi Yehuda says you can. Neither one is consistent with Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha. The Tanya Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha Omer Milva b'shtarin from him, milva pen from him, mehem neshu k'meitzil miyadam, or neshu k'matzil miyadam. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha draws a distinction. He says, when are you not allowed to collect the money from them before the holiday? Because if it's a secured loan, if it's on a note. But then if it's on a note, then the idolater knows he's not getting out of it. So therefore, you can collect it from him after the fact. But if it was an oral loan, then in fact, Rabbi Yehuda would allow you to collect from them before. Then in fact, Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha would allow you to collect from them before the holiday, because it's like you're saving it from them. Otherwise, you're never going to get the money. It's not as secure as a loan on a note. So now that we said this teaching of Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, we're going to say actually 4 teachings of Rabbi Shimon Karcha. Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Achori de Rabbi Abba, Yosef Rabbi Abba Kamei de Rav Huna, Yosef Ka'amar. So Rabbi Abba said the following. Hilchos Rabbi Shimon Karcha, Hilchos Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Abba said it was like Rabbi Shimon Karcha, and it was like Rabbi Yehuda. Hilchos Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, Hada Amran. How do we say it was like Rabbi Yeshua? That which we just said, that he draws a distinction between whether or not you're allowed to collect money from the idolater before the holiday, if it's a secured loan or an unsecured loan. And Hilchos Rabbi Yehuda. What do we agree? Do we say the law is like Rabbi Yehuda? Actually, it's the Tanah, not the Tanya. It's a Mishnah in Baba Kama, which states, and those in Semer Etzavo Etzbo Adam Etzavo Shachar Etzavo Adam. Let's say you gave a piece of fabric to a dyer, and you told the dyer to dye it red, and the dyer dyed it black, or vice versa. You told him to dye it black, and he dyed it red. So Rabbi Meir's on a position. We're on the top of 6-3. Omer Noselo to mate tomorrow. Rabbi Meir says the dyer basically stole the wool from the customer, and he has to pay him for the fabric, and then he gets to keep the finished product. That's what Rabbi Meir says. So Rabbi Meir says basically he has to just give him the value of the wool. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda says, no, the customer is going to get the better end of the deal here. And basically, if the expenses for the finished product were $50 and the price went up $100, then the customer has to pay the lesser of the two, which is the expenses. But if the expenses were greater and the improvement was less, then he only pays the improvement, meaning to say the customer has the upper hand. So that's what Rabbi Abba said. So Adrino Rabbi Yosef Ape. So Rabbi Yosef was sitting basically in front of Rabbi Abba, turned his face away from him. He was upset. So he's saying, Bishlam halacha Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha. It's tricha. I know why you had to tell us that the law is like Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, because he was arguing with the Chacham and the Rabbi Yehuda. So I might have thought the law is like the majority against him. Fine, it teaches us the laws like the individual. Why do you have to tell us the laws like Rabbi Yehuda? Pshita, it's obvious. Here it's a dispute, because it's a Mishnah in Baba Kama, it's a dispute between Rameh and Rabbi Yehuda. But afterwards in Baba Metzia, there's an anonymous Mishnah. And we have a concept, that if you have a dispute followed by anonymous, the law is like the anonymous. The dispute in Baba Kama, and the anonymous is in Baba Metzia. We're in the middle of Zion Amanal of 7a, around 10 lines from the top. The Tanah, we learn in Baba Metzia, called Meshana Yadu Atachtona. We learn this principle in Baba Metzia. It says whoever changes the terms of the deal, he gets the lower hand. And any employer goes back on his agreement with the workers, he also gets the lower hand. Some halachos are about employees and employers. So why are you telling us this? So why is Rav Huna? I think I was saying that Rabbi Abba was saying it. No, Rav Huna was saying it. So why was Rav Huna having to tell us this when it's obvious? It's a dispute filed by anonymous. So obviously the case is like Rabbi Yehuda, like Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says, Rav Huna says, why do I have to tell you? Mishum de'ein seder or Mishnah. Because even though we have Baba Kama and Baba Metzia, that's not necessarily the order. The Mishnahs are not written in order, so it's not necessarily the case that it's a dispute filed by an anonymous. Equal Mamers saw some Tana Beresh because you could say first the Mishnah and Baba Metzia appeared, and then the dispute happened between Rabbi Yehuda and Meir. So the rest says, well, if that's the case, then this rule never applies. If that's the case, says Rabbi Yosef, then we can never have this principle, because we could say there's no order to the Mishnah. So the idea that anytime there's a dispute filed by the anonymous, that rule can never apply. So what will Rav Huna say back to Rabbi Yosef? Rav Huna says, Ki lo amrina nein seder. Yeah, when do we say that there's no order? When do we say there's no order to Mishnayos, that it's not necessarily written recorded in the order in which the discussion took place in one tractate, but B'trei Masechtas Amrinan. And when it's over two tractates, then we say that there is no order, because who knows which Seder each yeshiva learns a different Gemara. Within the Gemara, they're going to learn it in order, but between the different tractates, there's no order, and so therefore, just because one Mishnah is in Bava Kama, then one next one's in Bava Metzia, doesn't mean the one in Bava Metzia was studied afterwards. And Rav Yosef responds, no, Kol Nezikin Chadam Masechta, all of Nezikin, and here probably most say it just means all the Babas, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Basra, they're all one tractate. They're all 10 chapters, so it's really one long tractate that was divided into three tractates. It's all one tractate. The Ibayis Emer alternatively, so that's the first answer. Rav Yosef says it's all one tractate, so therefore it's obviously the case that the law is like the anonymous Mishnah, which is like Rabbi Yehuda. Or Ibayis Emer, a different answer, that what's the reason why it's obviously the case that the law is like the Stam? Mishum de Katani lo gabi Hilchasa Pasikta, because in the second case it was written down. From the context, it's very clear that they're giving a halachic ruling, because they said kol meshana yado atachtona, kol chozer bo yado atachtona, giving these halachic rulings in that Mishnayos. It's stating it as general principles, and so therefore it's like almost like a code, and so therefore it's clearly the case that the halacha should be like that, and that's why Rav Yosef says it's obvious, and he turned his face away from Rav Huna. So now the Gemara says, since we said the halacha like Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, we now say other halachas. Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha says the halacha. Tan Rabbanan, well, Yomer Adam l'chaver, a person shouldn't say to their friend, Anira shetamod imila Arab. We're talking about a case where a person is standing there on Shabbos, and he wants to do something with his friend. So he wants to hint to him, meaning to say, let's go see what's going on Shabbos. To do, meet me here. You want to meet me here Saturday night at 10 o'clock just by the construction site? You can't hint like that. You know how to discuss your responsibilities for after Shabbos on Shabbos. Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha Omer Adam l'chaver anir shetamod imila Arab. Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha allows it because it's hinting to the fact. So that's the second teaching of Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha. And I'm Rabbi Yochanan halachik Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha. The law is like it. Third ruling, somebody, this is very relevant. A person asks a rabbi, and the rabbi says it's tamei. You can't ask another chacham and make and to get him to allow it. He asks one chacham and the chacham prohibits it. You can't ask another chacham and he'll allow it. Let's say there's two rabbis in the town. One says it's done, one says tar. One says permitted, one's prohibited. If one of the rabbis was greater in wisdom, how do you determine that? The minyan, either followers or else maybe years. This is all disputed. If you follow that one who's greater, then otherwise, follow the stringent one if nobody's greater. Rabbi Shimon Karcha says, "B'shel Torah halacha machmir." If it's a biblical law, you follow the stricter one. B'shel Sofrim halacha mekil. If it's a rabbinic one, you follow the lenient position. Amar Rav Yosef hilchos like Rabbi Shimon Karcha. Rav Yosef the law is like Rabbi Shimon Karcha. Of course, the irony is that there's a dispute here, and how do we know who followed Rav Yosef? How do we know who followed Rabbi Shimon Karcha? There's a dispute about how we apply the principles. So Tosfos says, very bothered by this. Tosfos says, "Vim tomer v'chilo yishal kol chachamim v'yadunu zem zeh yishivu midvarav." Maybe you should ask all the rabbis, and then they'll discuss it, and then they'll come up with the best answer. So Tosfos says it's only prohibited to the person who asked the question if he doesn't tell them that I already asked this person who prohibited it. But if he says I already asked this person, then it's permitted. Because then the Chachamim know the full context. But then the second person has to be very careful not to allow it. Because he has to be you have to tell them that you've already asked. Uh, so now Tosa says another point here, and then we'll just go on because it's too interesting, and we'll spend the whole day on it. Tosa says only if his friend prohibited it is the second one not allowed to permit it. But let's say the first rabbi permitted it, the second one is allowed to prohibit it. So the reason is because once you asked him, it became prohibited to you. That's Tosfos's distinction. So if he permitted it, you can go to another rabbi who'll prohibit it. But others say no. The reason for why you can't go to more than one rabbi is because it's disrespectful to the first rabbi. And so then it wouldn't matter if the distinction is between some people, if it's permitted versus prohibited. Some people love to find the strict position. They're not happy. They're not happy with the lenient position. They have all sorts of background context, and they weren't happy with the ruling. Who knows why? Maybe they wanted to not do something, and the rabbi was their excuse, and the first rabbi didn't help them do that. Okay, Tanu Abanan, V'kulin Shechazur B'hen Emakil Emikabonosan Olamis. So here we're talking about we want to rely upon people to trust their kashrus, to trust their meiser, that they took meiser. So anybody who repented, let's say we're talking about Rashi says they were robbers or Amei Aretz, but now we know that they did tshuva, you can never accept them. Meir says they never gain back their credibility. Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha says Chazru ben Matmonius but for Hesia, so Rabbi Yehuda, not Rabbi Shimon Karcha. Rabbi Yehuda says that if they repented in secret, we don't accept them, but in public we accept them. Others say if they did their sin in secret, we don't accept them. But for Hesia, if they did in secret, we accept them. But for Hesia, but if they did their sin in public, we don't accept them. On top of 7b, for Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, Omrim. So here we have the fourth teaching of Rabbi Shimon ben Karcha. He says, we always accept them back, as it says, Shuvu banim shovavim, return, O wayward children. Even if they did it intentionally and before Hasya. So Rashi says, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Ish Kfar Akva, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Hilchasaka, Uso Azud. The law is like Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Shimon ben Karcha. So now, we say the next Mishnah, Rabbi Shmuel, Omer, Shlosh Lefneim, Shlosh Achreim. Our first Mishnah said, can't do business with the idolater 3 days before the holiday. Rabbi Shmuel says you can't do business 3 days before or 3 days after. Both cases it's prohibited. The Chamim Omrim Lifnei Dein Asar, the Achar Dein Mutter. Whereas, so Rabbi Shmuel says you also can't do it 3 days after. And then the Chamim come along and say before their holiday. They don't say 3 days. They say before their holiday is prohibited and after is permitted. So Amar Tachlifi Bar Avdimi Amar Shmuel Yom Echad L'Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. Those idolaters who worship on their day is Sunday. According to Rabbi Shmuel, well, you can never do business with them because it's always 3 days before and 3 days after their holiday. That's the second time we have a reference to this teaching of Shmuel. So the Gemara says, the Chachamim said before their holiday is prohibited. Well, Chachamim, Tanakama, what's the distinction? The Tanakama in the Mishnah, it said 3 days before is prohibited. And the Chachamim are also saying before their holiday is prohibited. So the Gemara is going to give 4 answers. The one distinction is Hain below day and Ikabenayo. So whether when it says the 3 days, that counts the holiday itself. So Tanakama suffer Hain below day, and it's the 3 days, not accounting the holiday. So it's a total of 4 days. Rabbanan Savri Basri Savri Hain Vidain. No, that the days that you can't do business before and includes the holidays. So it's the holiday plus 2 days. The second answer, maybe the distinction between the first Chacham and the second one is, let's say you actually did business, are you allowed to gain benefit from it? Tanakama Saranasa Natan Mutter, that once you did business, you can gain benefit. Rabbanan Savri, Rabbanan Basri Savri, the second rabbi said, no, Savanatan Asar. Once you did business, you can't gain benefit from it. Third approach, the third approach is Shmuel. Remember Shmuel, Begola and Asar El Yom Dam. Shmuel said the people outside of Israel, they're not real idolaters. It's only prohibited the day of their festival. So Tanakama Islay the Shmuel. Tanakama agrees with Shmuel. Rabbanan Batzrai lays with the Shmuel, but the later rabbis don't. The fourth distinction is maybe following Nachum Amadi. principle. The Nachum Hamadi, the time Nachum Hamadi said, "Eino Asra Yom Echad Ufnei." And he says, look, the rabbis in the second part of the Mishnah didn't say 3 days. Maybe they only prohibit 1 day before their festival. And Tanakama Leisley the Nachum Hamadi, Rabbanim Basra Yislu the Nachum Hamadi. So the first position doesn't agree with Nachum Hamadi because they say 3 days, but the latter position could be consistent with him. It could be 1 day is prohibited. So now the Gemara is going to analyze this Nachum Hamadi and say that there are 3 teachings from Nachum Hamadi. Gufa Nachum Hamadi, Omer Ein Wetzer Al Yom Echad Beidin. Amar Lo, Nishtaka Davar. They were very upset by this. The rabbi said, no way, Nishtaka Davar. Forget this matter. Meaning to say, Rashi gives 2 explanations what this means. Nobody should ever say this. Shut your mouth, delete your account. Alternatively, don't publicize this matter. Nishtaka Davar. Why not? Don't the later rabbis agree with him? So who say only 1 day before the holiday is prohibited? No. Who are those rabbis? They are Nachum Hamadi. And so they said, delete it. A second thing he says, so this refers to the fact that you're not allowed to sell a behema gasa. There was a prohibition against selling a large animal to an idolater because the concern was that maybe he's going to come to borrow or to rent it to him, an animal, and then he's going to use it on Shabbos. So Nachum Hamadi says that you're allowed to sell a male horse and an old horse if it's a time of war, because that's something that he wouldn't buy. He's just taking it regularly. He's just taking it because it's a time of war. And also, you're not going to work it. And so therefore, since you're not going to work the animal, it's permitted to sell. The prohibition the decree doesn't apply. But they said, don't, delete this. Gemara says, but why? Ben Becerra agrees with him. Now, Ben Becerra, Matir Basus. Ben Becerra allowed you to sell a horse. So the Gemara says, no, the problem was Ben Becerra will malfog Ben Zacharim when Akevas. Ben Becerra allowed you to sell a horse because the horse you ride on it, and even though it's rabbinically prohibited on Shabbos, it's not biblically prohibited. Ben Becerra didn't draw any distinctions between a male horse and a female horse. He just allowed you to sell it, and so therefore, we don't care if you're going to borrow it or lend it. But Nachum Hamadi, and the fact that he draws a distinction between a male horse and a female horse, it must be hold like the rabbis who argue with him and say that you're not allowed to sell a horse to idolater because it's going to learn how to do some work. And according to the Rabbanan, Nachum Hamadi's words are prohibited. And so therefore, we say forget it. The third approach is no, an idolater is not allowed to use your animal on Shabbos. So it's a decree against it. No, you're not allowed to sell because it's a decree because you might come to borrow it, you lend it, or rent it, and that's prohibited. So Ben Becerra allowed it with a horse because a horse was not something that was a biblical prohibition. But the rabbis were worried about the biblical prohibitions associated with a horse. And so therefore, they didn't allow it. The third approach is Tanya Nachum Hamadi Omer. The third position of Nachum Hamadi that our daf talks about is about the following. So hasheves is it's like a type of herb. It's made dill or mustard. So hasheves mitaseres. There are different points of the way when you pick it that you have to tithe it because it could be eaten in different stages. Zera, v'yerak, v'zirin. Whether it's in its seed form, its vegetable, or its husk. And so 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 that's what Nachman Madi said. V'amrlo nishtaka davar v'onamar. He said, don't say it. Don't say this. Because the zera is really for its seed. And so therefore, if you planted it when it's a vegetable, if you harvest it when it's a vegetable or its husk, you're not liable for Meiser. And Mara says, really? Doesn't Rabbi Elazar agree with him? Mara says, Rabbi Elazar Omar Shavas Metaseres Zera V'Yerak B'Zirin. No, Hasam B'Digenu Nisa. No, Rabbi Elazar says that you take the Meiser when it was in your garden. And then you grow for multiple things. But Nachman Madi was talking about all types of shevises, whether it grows in your garden or in your fields. And when about what grows in the field, they said delete your account. When a person comes from this place, from Bavel, from Eretz Madai, from Medea, and Kol Milsa the Amar Amri, this poor guy, he's such a great man. He comes from Medea. I don't know exactly where Medea is. Is that Greece? Northwestern Persia. He comes from there, and whatever he says, we say, never say this. Amar, no, don't worry, says Abaye. He said one thing that we should follow. The Tanya Nachman Badi Omer Shol Adam Tzarcha V'Shomei Tefillah. When a person davens the bracha of Shomei Tefillah and the Amida, that's when you're supposed to ask your personal bakashas, your personal prayers to God. Amar Bar Minei Dahi. So Rav Acha Bar Menyumi says no, that one actually he didn't. That one exclude. Don't bring a proof from that. The Talia Ba'asar Rav Ravi, because this law is dependent upon very long, strong ropes. And meaning to say, the reason why this halacha was accepted is because other rabbis said it. The Tanya Rabbi Elazar Omer Shol Adam Tzarchav Ba'achtach Yispal. A person should ask his needs, and only afterwards should he pray. As it says, Tfilu Ani Kiyatov, L'fnei Hashem Yishpoch Sicho. The prayer of a poor man will wrap himself. Before Hashem, he pours out his words. Meaning, first the person should say his prayers, and only afterwards, first he should pour out his needs, and only afterwards should he pour out his words to God. Tzicha means prayer. It says Yitzchak went out to pray, to talk in the field. Rabbi Shua says in the opposite. First you pray to God, and then you ask your needs. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Elazar nami aksiv eshpocha fanav sichi. What does Rabbi Elazar do with the pasuk that Rabbi Yeshua cited from Tehillim? So he says, this is what it means. When do I say my Amida? When I already said the needs that I'm praying for. Rabbi Yeshua nami aksiv filani kiyato. Doesn't Rabbi Yeshua have that verse also? When is a person supposed to say his needs? Is Mount Shafnei Hashem Yishpoch Sicha, at a time where before God he poured out his prayers. So the Gemara says, "Milchti cry lokamar daiki b'may. So since the pasuk could be read either way, what's the basis of their dispute? So because the Darash Rabbi Simai, the second time Rabbi Simai cited in our tractate, a person should always prepare praises of God and only afterwards pray. On who's the source of that? Moshe Rabbeinu Delsef Hashem Elokim Atachi Lo Salarot Sabdecha. It says first. Moshe says, and then it says, Hashem, you show me your greatness. And only afterwards does he say, let me pass into the land. And so Moshe Rabbeinu's prayer is the source of how we should pray. It's ironic to me that this is the prayer that's the source of prayer, Moshe Rabbeinu's prayer. Rambam cites this in opening to the laws of prayer. But this is a prayer that wasn't accepted. Moshe's prayer was rejected. He didn't get the opportunity to go in. Rabbi Yeshua says we learn from Moshe that's how we should do it. Rabbi Elazar saver lo yafinu Moshe. Shani Moshe derav guver. So Rabbi Yeshua says first you praise God and then you ask your needs. But Rabbi Elazar says no, first you ask your needs. Moshe is different because he is so much smarter and greater. So therefore he should first talk about the praise of God and then talk about his needs. But the other person, if you first start praising God, it looks like it's arrogant and it's prohibited. The Chachamim Omrim lo k'divrei zeh lo k'divrei zeh al shol adam tzarcha v'shomei tefillah. The Chachamim saying you're supposed to ask your needs, which in the context of the prayer of shomei tefillah, right in the middle. And that's what we said, that in that context, that's what Nachum Hamadi said, but there are other rabbis who said it. Um, so in that context, there's a accuracy here. Okay, we'll stop here because it's time is up, and we'll pick this up tomorrow. God willing.